Do you have tips for writing twists and turns in a screenplay to really keep that audience guessing so that it's a movie where you would want to see it because you can't figure it out? If you go in cold, you're not going to be able to figure it out.
Well, I think the best tip on that, I think, is if the story is coming from your imagination or from what you're inspired by from real life, or what you're inspired by that's not from another movie, that will be like that would naturally make it be less predictable. If you're not copying a movie you've seen or thinking about, well, what did other movies do when they did this? If you're just bringing the story from imagination and playing with it that way, I think that inherently already right from the beginning will help you do things that are unpredictable because you're not basing it on something that's already been done. I think that the trap you can fall into is like, there was a trope with slasher movies, which I love a good slasher movie, but there's a trope in the 80s, it became a parody and a joke where they would do fake jump scares where people would open a closet and the cat would jump out. And it would be like this joke in a while, like, how long has this cat been trapped in this closet? So it could like jump out and scare. But it's funny because even, in Alien, there's a scene where the locker gets opened and the cat jumps out and it's a fake jump scare. But it's perfect in Alien and it's handled beautifully. But, it's like, but then everyone's like, oh, the cat jump scare became like this. It became a joke, as it should be, because and then it became used in parodies, which is great, using it in a parody. But so I think that a lot of it has to do with just not doing what's been done before. And, you can always try to like attack that more intellectually if you're aware of having seen a bunch of horror movies by just deliberately making sure you don't do what's already been done. Or if you know that's been done, you make sure if your story naturally has something similar that you figure out a way to make sure it goes in a different direction so you don't go the direction that it usually goes into. And that's something that we worked really hard with Echoes of Fear. There's a very big turn in the end of the second act into the third act, which is very organic to the story, but it's a very big turn in the story, which a lot of people are really responding to from the festival plays. The festival audience is really responding to that because, once again, it takes it in a direction that you're not expecting from how you're watching the movie, and you think it's following this path of the way this type of movie it is, but then it goes in a completely different way. But once again, that came from the fact that the first part of the movie was inspired by real events, so we drew from that, and the other stuff came from true events and true stories that we heard about, so we incorporated that into the story and segued that in. And that's what made it unique, because it wasn't following like a formula or a particular pattern, or wasn't even obeying the rules of just falling neatly into a particular subgenre. It kind of added a subgenre as it got into heading into the third act. And there's been a great response from that. So I definitely think that it's always good, no matter what story or genre, if you can, think outside the box in terms of like, just based on how you come up with your story, it'll happen naturally, as long as you're not copying things, I think. And then if you feel like your story is naturally falling into being too similar to something, then you can work actively against it. You can like decide like to actively like make sure you do the left turn when everyone else does the right turn. If you have to. If it just happens that like it feels like it's getting too close to something, you can intellectually decide to do that. But I think it works best when it's organic. When you're coming up with a story, it kind of works best when the story evolves and naturally those twists and turns happen because of the story. It's always best if it can just happen as you develop the story naturally, I think.
Did you ever catch yourself in the beginning like, you know what, this is way too similar to this one scene in a Brian De Palma movie. I can't do this. This is too much like out. Did you ever see, because I think it's natural for writers as well. Right. You're going to emulate those that you're watching, you're reading, and then you realize, oh wait, I'm becoming that voice that's not original. I know it's kind of hard to see, especially if it's your own.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I think it was a trap. It was easier to fall into initially when I was writing the scripts that didn't even get made before we even did our first feature. I feel like I pretty much actively fight against it. I know that definitely when we come to orchestrating suspense and tension, and especially a scare, earning that scare organically and naturally, not using the tropes that are overused and doing the same. And that might be an example of kind of like actively working to turn left instead of right. Actively working to not do the thing that's usually done, both in terms of sound design, in terms of music, in terms of like the build to that moment, to execute it differently.
What makes a good horror protagonist?
A good horror protagonist? Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I think any protagonist, in any genre, I think it has to be an interesting character. It doesn't have to necessarily be a likable character, but there has to be something about the character which is fascinating and interesting, that you want to know what they're going to do and you're invested in terms of what's going to happen to them. And I think that's really the key. Obviously it's like one of the scripts we talked about, the intense psychological horror film with the female protagonist. Someone could inverse that script and see her as the antagonist, but she's the main character. It's her story, so she's the protagonist. But once again, it's like what she goes through, and she's a very fascinating character in terms of what she's experienced and what she's become, and what happens to her and how she responds to it. It really much pulls you in the horror thing in terms of, well, what's going to happen next? How is she going to get out of that? How is she going to solve that problem? What's going to happen to her? Oh my gosh, what she just did, what is that going to lead to? And I think especially in horror, that has a lot to do with it, is whether you like the protagonist or you don't like the protagonist, or the protagonist is an anti-hero. A lot of it has to do with like seeing what's happening to them, how they respond to it, or what they do, which makes the things happen to them, and just kind of seeing that riddle in terms of what it leads to, like what every step leads to and how the character responds. So I think the key is like the character, everything the character does needs to be in character. It has to be a response that that character would have. And of course, as the movie moves along, lots of times your character will change because the character will have an arc. But it's natural and organic in terms of what's happening to this character. Their change is because of the world is bombarding them based on their actions. And I think watching that unfold, especially in terms of horror, if there's suspense and mystery, is like one of the things that really pulls you in, because you're invested, because you want to know what's going to happen, with that character.